Oh, well, welcome today. We are starting a new series this morning that I'm really excited about. It's called This is the Church. And maybe you remember the little nursery rhyme from your childhood. You know, right? How does it, right? Here's the church, here's the steeple, open it up, and there's all the people, and then you do it this way, but we're not going to talk because that would be bad. Like to have no people. Well, maybe after church is done, but that's okay. And so from that very early age, we work into our brains that the church is this building that has a steeple, and that the people are something else that are sometimes there and sometimes not. But the church is a building. But we know that's not true. I mean, we call our buildings where our churches meet churches, and so the language gets a little weird. But every time the Bible talks about the church, it's never talking about a geographical location or a physical building. It's always talking about people. And so we're going to talk about what it means to be a people called church over the next few weeks. And as we all know, churches come in all shapes and sizes, right? There are little white country churches that are scattered across rural corners of the country. There are grand cathedrals in Europe. There are churches that meet in coffee shops and bars and living rooms. And each and every one of these snapshots of what a church can be says something unique about the place, the church in society and in the world. They all offer a unique perspective on what the church has meant to people across time and across the ages, and what the church has to offer us in the present, and how the church is adapting to our changing culture, becoming the church of the future. There are other kinds of churches too. There are churches that, over the years, have turned the very word church into a dirty word for lots of people. You're probably familiar with Westboro Baptist Church. They've gained notoriety. They wind up in the news, not by growing in numbers or by making a difference in the world, but by protesting in the name of hate. The signs they carry announce that God hates, and the looks on their faces confirm that they really believe it. They fund all, and here's something you might not know, they fund all the expenses of going crisscrossing the country to protest at these events. They fund them all by suing anyone who confronts them at the protest. And yet, they use the word church for what they do, just like we use the word church for what we do. And even though the message that you hear at Northern Light could not be more different than the message that they are announcing, we think God's love offers complete acceptance to all people everywhere without exception. And so that's what we do. We try and offer God's love and acceptance to all people everywhere without exception. Still, they're a church, and we're a church. Or there's a church that made the news this week, Relentless Church in Greenville, South Carolina. It was actually after I had already put my whole sermon together. I saw a picture on Instagram of the pastor of this church wearing a pair of $5,000 Nike Yeezys to preach on Sunday morning, because Jesus. So this 10,000 member church was in the news this week because news got out about the $1.8 million home that the church bought for the pastor, and the $800,000 Lamborghini that the pastor bought for his wife for their anniversary. And, I mean, we're a church, and they're a church, right? Somehow, and they're coming from a different perspective, right? Somehow, even non-religious people who would never set foot in a church know that there's something off balance, right? When a church is flaunting that kind of wealth and using it for itself. What's even more interesting to me about this story, though, is that one of the former pastors of this church came back last Sunday and defended this pastor in the sermon. She threatened the newspaper that broke the story, saying, "I cut people. I got a knife right in my pocketbook. Greenville News, come on." Like, threatening violence against the newspaper that just simply told the story of the thing that was real, right? So, the official position of a church is there's nothing wrong with a millionaire pastor, but if you tell anybody about him, I'll cut you. Right? So, between stories like these and scandals that happen in the Catholic Church and elsewhere, you can't blame people who think that the church is at best an old institution that's seen its day, and at worst, the church is something that does more harm than good, and that an institution that the world would be better off without. You can't blame people for feeling that way. I know I don't. And I don't mean to speak ill of any other church or any other way of believing. I simply want to highlight the complexity of the situation that churches of the world have found themselves in. In the Middle Ages in Europe, the church ran the show. Even the kings had to get the church's blessing for what they wanted to do. And when Puritan Christians first came to colonize North America, Christianity was just assumed. And there was a time in Western history when the church justified your existence. And now, the world is asking the church to justify its existence. And the church needs to have a worthy response. Why do we exist, and what are we up to? And so, we're going to go back to the beginning together. Before the cathedrals, before the megachurches, before popes with armies and preachers with Lamborghinis, to a letter written to the first ever followers of Jesus to live in the city of Rome, the heart of the Roman Empire. And in chapter 9 of this letter, we just heard a little bit from this a little while ago, in chapter 9 of this letter called Romans, the author is talking about the idea of God's people. So that's the concept that he's having a conversation with this audience about. And in the Old Testament, we read about how God picked the people of Israel, right? Isaac and Jacob, right? And they were his favorites. They were the ones who inherited God's promises. They were the ones through whom God told God's story. Of course, there's a fundamental problem with God choosing just one nation in all of the world to be his favorite. Because the way that we hear that is, well, if one people is chosen, then all the other people are unchosen, right? If God says to these people, you're in, doesn't that mean God is saying to everyone else, you're out? And that's the question that this letter sent to ancient Rome is trying to address at this particular moment. Here's what the letter says about this idea of chosenness. And this is a different translation than you heard before. It says, what if God, although choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath, prepared for destruction? What if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for glory? I need to pause for a moment because first of all, this is complicated, right? I see some quizzical looks right now. So there's some language around the wrath and power of God, and I want to talk about that for a second, because it's easy to get a little nervous and skip past these parts and say, I don't understand what's going on here, and I'll just move on. But we need to pause for a moment. There's a basic principle behind these ideas of God's anger and wrath that I want to explain before we go any further. God's wrath is not something that God actively and eagerly inflicts on us poor sinners. God is not rubbing God's hand together fiendishly, waiting to smite evildoers, all right? And God is not waiting to smite the wicked of the world or us. If God is love, we agree that makes sense, right? God is love. The Bible says that. And if we always start there when we're trying to make sense of the Bible, if God is love, then even God's wrath, this idea of God's wrath, has to hold together in light of this love. There's a way of life, and here's how I do that. There's a way of life that is in line with the flow of God's love in the world. There are ways of life that work against the flow of God's love in the world too. And this flow is how the maker of all things designed things to go, but sometimes we try and push against it. And when we do that, it makes life hard. Sometimes it makes life painful. And the way that all this makes the most sense to me is if God's wrath is simply a way that ancient people made sense of the consequences of going against the flow of love that God has set in motion in the world. So now we've dealt with that messy bit a little, and we can talk more about that if you want to later. If you have questions or you want to disagree with me, that's always fine. That's always welcome here. But let's go back to this letter. One thing I want to point out is that this wasn't originally written in English, right? It was written to ancient Rome. It was written in ancient Greek. And the word in Greek that gets translated as objects in this verse I read is actually Skew Us. And it absolutely does mean kind of object. But when you read it in English, it has this passive sense to the word, like we are just the recipients of God's mercy or wrath. And we just kind of sit there as the object, like we're the direct object of the verb of God's mercy or wrath, right? And all we do is take it. But this word, skeuos, isn't really like that. Skeuos is a useful thing. It's something you use to do something or to hold something. It's something you do stuff with. So it's like a vessel or an implement. And so if the Bible is describing people as vessels of God's wrath instead of just objects of God's wrath, it means that we not only hold within ourselves the results of working against the flow of God's love, but we also inflict that wrath on others. And I bet we all know someone like that. And sometimes on my worst day, it's even me, right? I've inherited the fruit of my working against God's love, and then I shout at my kids, and they experience it too. And this ancient letter is kind of assuming that we all know that story about God's wrath, that it's something that we create and something that we unleash on others. That we know what it looks like to go around slashing and burning your way through life. We know what it means to grasp at power and wealth. We know all that we do is leave a path of hurt and sadness behind us if that's the way we live. But the letter doesn't stop at wrath, thank God. It says, after that, it says, we know the story about God's wrath, but what if? We know the story about God's wrath, but what if? What if God did this? What if God chose a group of people to make the riches of God's glory known to the vessels of God's mercy, whom God prepared in advance for glory? So here's what the letter's trying to say, all right? This whole time, we've assumed that God picked a chosen people because they were so much better than everyone else. And that if God picked these people, God unpicked those people. But if you read pretty much any part of the Bible, you'll see that God's people are officially just as screwed up as everybody else, right? What if we aren't chosen to lord our chosenness over others? What if we're chosen so that we can shower the world with mercy? What if we are the vessels of God's mercy for the sake of the world? What if we are the instruments of God's ongoing creation, bringing life wherever we go? In the words of Father Richard Rohr, what if your chosenness is for the sake of letting others know they are also chosen? And if that's the case, and I really think it is, if that's the case, if the church isn't chosen for its own sake, but for the sake of the whole world, it changes everything. It means it's backwards when a church goes out of its way to tell people that they're wicked and hated. It means it's wrongheaded when a church spends more on the pastor's home than it does on the homeless. It means that every time the church has been self-serving or abusive or self-promoting, it hasn't only been wrong, it has been at odds with the very purpose of the creation of the idea of church from the beginning. To be an instrument of mercy for the benefit of the world. The church shouldn't be a club for insiders. It should be a gift to the world in the way it announces that everybody is on the inside of God's love. And that's why I grabbed the scripture from Rick, because of the way this ends. A quote from the prophet Hosea, I'll call nobodies and make them somebodies. All those outsiders, guess what? You're insiders. I'll call the unloved and make them beloved, which means if all the unloved are suddenly beloved, guess what? There are no more unloved anywhere. There's only beloved. And so that's why I don't really blame anyone who doesn't go to church. I get it. The church has not justified its existence very well in this generation, especially. I know that there are a million reasons why people don't go to church. And if you're my Facebook friend, you probably saw my informal poll online this week. It was really, really fascinating. Here's what I wrote. I wrote, be brutally honest. For those of you who don't go to church, why not? And I got a lot of answers, and a really wide variety of answers, too. For some people, it was just the busyness of life with kids. For some, it was, the pastor they loved went away, and nothing felt right anymore. Someone said that their experience of churches is that they are creepy and unsafe. For some, it's the way that churches have failed to include and accept people who are different. For some, it's just straight-up skepticism in the whole proposition of God. One person chimed in and said, oh man, do you have time to listen because it'll take me a page or two. And this person was actually a former student of mine when I taught at a Bible college. So I messaged her and let her know I really did want to hear her whole story. And it turned out her letter was actually 3 pages long. And she had done some work as an EMT, and so you'll hear a little bit about how that affected her in what she wrote. I'm just going to give you a little excerpt of her letter about why she couldn't set foot inside of a church. She wrote this letter to the church. For those who dare bear their humanity for the church to see, watch out. You won't make it long. They will kick you out because the rawness of life doesn't fit in with the Hillsong Stepford Wives gospel they've built for themselves. Tell them you're in an abusive relationship, and the pastor will tell you that it's between you and God, and we don't have the answers for you, while he holds a Bible in his hand. Tell them you're struggling with depression and anxiety, and they'll tell you to pray more. Share with them your darkest secrets, and they will pretend they don't see you in public, when you couldn't be more in their line of sight if a neon sign flashing your name was above your head. Tell them you're scared that your dad is dying. They'll tell you it's not a reason to self-destruct. They will tell you not to talk to you. They will tell people not to talk to you and describe you as a backslidden Christian because you asked for help. You bared the stuff that was rotting inside, and they had no idea what to do with it. And yet they claimed to hold the answer for the entire world and all its problems. I wouldn't send my mom. I wouldn't send the mom I saw holding her lifeless baby after we could no longer continue resuscitating him to your churches. Not in a million years. Would you just tell her that you'd be praying for her and that God still had a plan for her? The man I watched cry in anguish over his 14-year-old son's body after he put a bullet in his own head, asking him, why did you do this, son? He would not find solace or comfort in your arms. I sure didn't find help in my darkest hours from you. Shallow water cannot bathe wounds. You deny the reality of life and you cheapen the cross. You lack withness. Emmanuel means God with us. And I wish that we lived that. I wish that we lived that too. Don't you? I wish there was a church that welcomed people's whole selves, even the unpleasant parts. I wish there was a church that tried to be with people and not just offering a service for them. I wish there was a church that didn't leave spirituality in the sanctuary, but turned it into real relationships and real compassion. I wish there was a church that was willing to take a crazy risk, not only to justify our existence to a world that's watching, waiting for us to show up already, but to live into our calling to be vessels of mercy for the sake of the world. And that's exactly what we're trying to become here at Northern Light, isn't it? Now, don't get me wrong. We've got our flaws, right? Sometimes the light fixtures fall out. We make mistakes. We hurt one another. It happens. Sometimes, yeah, exactly. I'll get it wrong from time to time, and so will you. I'm not saying we're perfect, but I am saying that we are willing to do church in a radical and different way so that this church can justify its existence to a world that's losing its patience. A couple weeks ago, in case you missed it, we approved the decision to cancel our lease so that we'd have more funds to share with those in need in our community. Today, after worship, we're going to look at the final proposal for where we are going, both in terms of location and mission. And in case you missed it, our goal is to move our resources more and more out the doors in the coming years so that eventually we are sharing 50% of our budget with those in need, and we'll use 50% to fund the things that we need to have a church, to have a place to meet and to learn and to grow and care for our kids and build community. But we'll use that other 50% to fund the ways that we're working to be the church, to live out the reality of what it means to be God's people, to be vessels of mercy for the sake of the world. And it won't be easy, but nothing worth doing is ever easy, am I right? I heard a woman this week who was describing her experience in physical therapy. The physical therapist shared that what she really needed to do, what physical therapy really entails, if it's really done right, the real work of physical therapy is to create thousands of tiny tears in your tissue, right, to hurt you. And it's to tear up that tissue that has grown around your injury. Your body heals in this way around the injury to protect it, but then you never get to move and live in the way that your body is intended unless you go through this painful process of tearing the way that you've healed in the wrong shape. You have to break down around that injury first before it can heal properly. And I think that's kind of what we're up to as a church, and I think that's the state of the church in our world today. It's like over the course of 2,000 years, the church has experienced harm and done harm, and now we've got all this scar tissue built up around us in the ways that we've thought about church and practiced church and talked about church. So it's not even doing the thing it was created to do in the first place. It's this stilted shell of its former self that can't go to work in the world in the way that it was made. And the only way to get it there is to start breaking things apart. The hard, painful process of naming the sins of the church and trying to live it out in a deeper, more authentic way. The church as we know it all around the country and the world has scar tissue built up around it, around its faults and failings. And we are going to do the hard work of stretching ourselves at this church a little farther than we think we can go so that we can be part of the healing process. Healing for the church, healing for our aching souls, healing for the world that God loves. And it's just what you do when you're a vessel of mercy. Pray with me. God, we turn to you today. We ask that you would continue to open our eyes. Wake us up as a country, as a society, as a church. Help us to see that we're here to do more than sing songs and teach lessons and to just go out and be nice people. There's so much more than that. You invite us into a way of life that changes everything. It changes this world, and we discover that it changes us along the way. And we ask that you would stir within us a holy passion, an energy we can't even explain, so that we can take up this mission and live lives as vessels of mercy. Amen.